Naomi Carter had always prided herself on her unwavering sense of purpose. Today, like most days, was no different. A dedicated Army advocate, she spent countless hours representing soldiers who often didn't have a voice in the legal battles they faced, whether it was about wrongful discharge, benefits, or the deep challenges of transitioning back into civilian life. But this afternoon, her focus was on something far more mundane: a parking ticket. As Naomi entered the courtroom, her heels clicking against the marble floors, she caught the eye of Judge Samuel Hughes, who sat at the front, looking over case files with a practiced disinterest. He was a man who believed in the rules, strictly and without exception. Naomi knew this from the reputation he had built over the years. His rulings were swift, his demeanor stern, and he rarely entertained excuses. For her, today was just another task to check off her long list, but she had no idea it would become the beginning of a significant turning point in her life. "Ms. Carter, I understand you're here today to address a parking violation," Judge Hughes said, his voice booming across the otherwise quiet courtroom. Naomi stood tall at the podium, composed, but the anxiety of a busy schedule weighed on her. She had a meeting in an hour with a high-ranking officer who needed her legal expertise on a delicate matter. "Yes, Your Honor. I was parked temporarily, and I did not expect to be long. It was a matter of urgency. I needed to attend a meeting in the courthouse next door regarding a military case. The timing was critical." Judge Hughes's gaze was skeptical. He had heard countless similar explanations in his years on the bench, and most were little more than thinly veiled excuses. He didn't seem to care much for the specifics of Naomi's work. "Urgency or not, parking regulations exist for a reason, Ms. Carter. You should have parked legally or found alternative arrangements. The law is clear." Naomi didn't flinch. She had heard similar lines before, both in and out of courtrooms. She knew better than to argue too hard on matters like this. Sometimes it was about choosing your battles wisely. "I understand, Your Honor," she said calmly, her voice steady but firm. "I'm willing to accept the fine, but I hope you'll take into account the nature of my work. It was a short stop, and I had no intention of violating the rules." Judge Hughes seemed unmoved. He glanced down at his paperwork, scribbled something on a form, and then looked up at Naomi with an air of finality. "The fine is set at $150. You may pay it at the clerk's office." He dismissed her with a sharp motion of his hand, signaling the end of the case. Naomi didn't argue. She stood, nodded once in acknowledgement, and left the courtroom with the same quiet dignity she had entered with. But as she made her way down the hall, she couldn't help but feel a slight pang of frustration. She knew the value of her work, of the many soldiers she represented who had faced far greater struggles than a parking violation. But today, in this courtroom, it seemed like none of that mattered. Unbeknownst to her, however, the wheels of a much bigger story were already beginning to turn. Judge Hughes would soon learn just how significant Naomi Carter's work truly was, and the outcome of today's minor infraction would take on a far deeper meaning than either of them could have anticipated. As Naomi exited the courtroom, the weight of the fine still felt like an annoyance more than anything else. She was used to setbacks, but they never made them any easier to accept. With a quick glance at the clock, she realized she had just enough time to meet with the officer she'd been scheduled to see. Her thoughts immediately shifted back to the pressing legal matter she was working on, the issue she was determined to solve. But back in the courtroom, the scene was far from over. Judge Samuel Hughes, after dismissing the case with finality, sat back in his chair and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The day had been busy, the docket long, and yet something about Naomi's case lingered in his mind. He had imposed the fine without a second thought, but as his clerk handed him the case file for the next hearing, his eyes caught a small detail. Naomi Carter wasn't just any citizen appearing for a routine violation. The clerk had been quick to note it, eager to keep things moving, but her words stuck in the judge's mind. "You know, Judge, Miss Carter is quite well known. She's an Army legal advocate, works with soldiers, especially on cases involving their rights. She's highly respected, even up at the Pentagon. The mention of the Pentagon made Judge Hughes pause. He'd heard the name before, but he hadn't made the connection. Naomi Carter was a prominent figure in legal circles, a defender of military personnel, many of whom had faced their own struggles in a system that sometimes seemed indifferent to their plight. The judge shifted in his seat, the fine he had just imposed now feeling like an afterthought. How could someone with such a reputation for fairness and diligence get tangled in something as trivial as a parking violation? A knot of curiosity began to form in his mind. He'd never been one for celebrity or status, but he could not deny that Naomi's work was important, and the more he thought about it, the more he questioned whether the fine had been the right call. Had he been too quick to dismiss her explanation? Was there more to this than met the eye? Before he could dwell on it further, his clerk added, "She's also worked closely with veterans groups and led multiple high-profile cases where soldiers were wrongfully discharged or mistreated. There's a lot of respect for her in the military community." Judge Hughes felt a slight twinge of regret. He had always prided himself on fairness, on treating each case equally, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that Naomi had deserved more understanding than he had shown. Her role as an Army advocate wasn't just a job. It was a commitment to defending freedom, to ensuring that those who served their country were treated justly. And yet, here she was, being fined for an unfortunate parking error. At that moment, Hughes made a decision. He wasn't sure yet how or when, but he was going to learn more about Naomi Carter. The curiosity had begun to grow, and he needed to know just how much of her story had been left untold in the small, forgotten corner of a courtroom that day. What had seemed like a minor infraction was quickly evolving into something much more complex. Naomi Carter's world was a far cry from the sterile, whitewashed halls of the courthouse she had just left. Her life, though grounded in the same principles of fairness and justice, was one of complexity, dedication, and a constant drive to make a difference. While her legal work as an Army advocate was demanding, it was also deeply personal. Naomi knew what it was like to feel powerless in a system that often overlooked people like her, and it was that feeling that had inspired her to pursue law in the first place. Growing up in a tight-knit neighborhood, Naomi had witnessed firsthand the sacrifices her family had made for the country. Her father, a former Army sergeant, had always taught her about the importance of service, honor, and integrity. But Naomi had also seen the flaws in the system. How many soldiers, especially those from underrepresented communities, found themselves caught in a web of bureaucracy, their voices unheard when they needed help the most. The stories of soldiers, young and old, who struggled after returning home from deployment or faced unjust treatment from the very institutions they had served, haunted her. It was these experiences that led Naomi to become a military advocate. She had spent years fighting for the rights of soldiers who had been wrongfully discharged, denied benefits, or mistreated while in service. Each case she took on was a reflection of her own determination to create a more just world for those who had given so much for their country. That afternoon, after leaving the courtroom, Naomi didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to the nearby Veterans Center, where she was meeting with a group of former soldiers. They were preparing for a pivotal case against a major defense contractor who had failed to honor the benefits promised to injured veterans. The room buzzed with nervous energy as Naomi walked in, her presence calming the room as she nodded to each of the men and women seated around the table. "All right, team," Naomi said, her voice strong yet reassuring. "We've got this. I know it's been a tough fight, but we're closer than ever to holding these people accountable." The veterans around the table nodded, their faces a mixture of determination and exhaustion. For them, Naomi was more than just a lawyer. She was a champion for their rights, someone who believed in them when many others didn't. She listened to their stories, their frustrations, their hopes, and then she made sure their voices were heard. Naomi knew that the case against the contractor would be difficult, but she was used to tough battles. She had learned early on that progress was rarely easy. It was the reason she had become a fighter, both in the legal realm and in life. After the meeting, she gathered her notes, preparing for the long hours ahead. The parking fine she had received earlier in the day seemed almost laughable in comparison to the monumental task at hand. Still, she couldn't help but think about the court experience. What had started as an insignificant moment, the fine, now lingered in her mind. As she prepared to return to her office, she couldn't help but wonder if the judge had truly understood what she was fighting for, or if he had simply seen her as another person in a long line of cases. Little did she know, Judge Hughes was already beginning to ask himself the same question. Back in his chambers, Judge Samuel Hughes sat quietly, staring out the window at the bustling street below. The usual calm of his afternoons had been replaced by a growing sense of unease. Naomi Carter's case, a simple parking violation, had lingered with him more than he had anticipated. The brief interaction in his courtroom now felt inadequate, like he had missed something important, a piece of the puzzle that was Naomi herself. Judge Hughes was not the type of man to dwell on doubts. In fact, his years on the bench had been marked by decisive rulings and unwavering adherence to protocol. But Naomi's calm yet firm demeanor, coupled with the information about her work, left him feeling unsettled. How could someone with such a vital role in military justice be treated as though she were just another defendant? His thoughts turned to his own service. Though he had never served in combat, Hughes had spent several years in the reserves and had seen firsthand the challenges faced by soldiers returning from deployment. He knew the struggles they faced in adjusting to civilian life, the difficulties of securing proper benefits, and the mental toll that service often took. Yet, despite this knowledge, he had been quick to judge Naomi's actions without truly understanding the weight of her responsibilities. With a sigh, Hughes picked up the phone and called his clerk. "I need you to pull up everything you can on Naomi Carter," he said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Her background, her work with the Army, anything that might explain why she's so involved with military advocacy. The clerk, who had been busy sorting through another case, paused at the unusual request, but quickly complied. As the minutes ticked by, Hughes felt an odd sense of anticipation. He had always prided himself on being impartial, on seeing each case through the same lens of justice. But something about Naomi's case was different. There was more to this story, something deeper than what had appeared at first glance. Within moments, the clerk returned with a file. "She's been involved in several high-profile cases," the clerk explained. "Most notably, she helped defend a group of soldiers who were wrongfully accused of misconduct. She's also led efforts to change policies that impact minority soldiers. And, according to the records, she's highly respected among both military personnel and veterans groups." Hughes leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. Naomi Carter wasn't just an advocate. She was a force, a champion for those whose voices had been silenced. He had dismissed her too quickly, assuming that a simple parking violation was all there was to her. But in reality, he had barely scratched the surface. A pang of regret washed over him. He had found a woman who was not only fighting for the freedom of others, but was also a vital part of a system that aimed to uphold the very values he had sworn to protect as a judge. How had he missed it? How had he failed to see the importance of her work in that fleeting moment in his courtroom? Hughes was beginning to realize that Naomi's case was far from ordinary. And though he couldn't undo the fine he had already imposed, he was determined to make things right in whatever way he could. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He would not let his misunderstanding of her define a relationship between them moving forward. The following morning, Naomi arrived at her office, her mind still partly occupied with the earlier incident in court. She had put the fine behind her for the most part. After all, there were bigger matters to attend to, but it continued to nag at her. Was it her own sense of pride that made the fine feel unjust, or was there something more to it? She wasn't sure, but as always, she pushed forward, diving into her work. The veteran's case was her primary focus, and she couldn't afford to waste time on distractions. However, just after noon, Naomi received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar yet surprising. "Ms. Carter, this is Judge Hughes. I'd like to meet with you, if you have the time." Naomi froze for a moment. The judge. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, especially after the way he had dismissed her case. She wondered briefly if this was a formality, or if he intended to double down on the fine. But his tone, though formal, was respectful, and there was an edge of sincerity that piqued her curiosity. "Judge Hughes," Naomi said, gathering herself, "I'm surprised to hear from you. Of course, I'll make time. What's this about?" "I'd like to discuss your work," he replied, his voice steady. "I've come to realize I may have overlooked the importance of what you do. I'd like to understand more." Naomi didn't hesitate. She knew this conversation was likely to be uncomfortable, but she also sensed that this could be an opportunity for something important. She agreed to meet him at a nearby cafe, where they could talk more informally, away from the rigid confines of the courtroom. An hour later, they sat across from each other at a small table, each with a cup of coffee. Judge Hughes had come alone, without his clerk or any of the usual formalities. Naomi studied him for a moment. She had seen him as the embodiment of authority, a figure who wielded power with an almost indifferent precision. But now, in person, he appeared more human. His posture was a bit more relaxed, and the sharpness in his eyes was softened by a trace of uncertainty. "Ms. Carter, I want to start by saying that I regret how things went down in court," Judge Hughes said, his voice surprisingly open. "I didn't fully understand who you were or the significance of your work at the time. And in hindsight, I see I made a hasty judgment." Naomi nodded slowly, though she wasn't quite sure how to respond. She wasn't looking for an apology. It wasn't in her nature to dwell on small slights, but there was something in his demeanor that felt different from the man she had encountered in the courtroom. This conversation, she realized, wasn't just about the fine. It was about a deeper reckoning. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge," she said carefully, "but it's not just about me. It's about the soldiers I represent, the ones who often don't have a voice, the ones who need someone to stand up for them when the system fails them. And I'm not just fighting for legal rights. I'm fighting for the dignity of those who have already given so much." Judge Hughes listened intently, his expression thoughtful. For the first time, he understood the gravity of her work, not just as a lawyer, but as an advocate for justice in a system that often overlooked the very people it was meant to protect. This wasn't a job to Naomi. It was a mission, a calling. "I had no idea," he said softly, more to himself than to Naomi. "I should have known." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply took a sip of her coffee, her mind already moving to the next steps. She had always known that her fight wasn't easy, that people like Judge Hughes, with their fixed perspectives, would need to be shown why things mattered. But this conversation, she realized, had just opened the door for change, and it wasn't a door she intended to close anytime soon. Judge Hughes sat back, processing Naomi's words with a deepening sense of awareness. The last few years on the bench had been routine, predictable cases, predictable outcomes. He built his career on maintaining order and fairness, but in doing so, he had become blind to the complexities of the world outside the courtroom. Naomi Carter had shown him that there was more at stake than the sterile lines of law he so often adhered to. The cafe grew busier around them, but neither of them moved. The conversation had shifted from polite pleasantries to something more meaningful, more personal. Naomi's words had cut through the formality of their meeting, revealing layers of injustice and human struggle that Judge Hughes had rarely confronted. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. "Judge, I understand that your role is to uphold the law, but sometimes the law itself isn't enough. It doesn't account for the full picture. It doesn't account for people like my clients, soldiers who return home only to find themselves abandoned by the system they fought to protect. And when someone like me steps in to try and fix it, we're often met with resistance. You see, it's not just about fighting legal battles. It's about restoring dignity, about showing people that their sacrifices matter." Judge Hughes, who had spent years in a system that was built on rules and precedents, felt a shift inside himself. He had always viewed the law as something fixed and absolute, but Naomi's words were beginning to challenge that view. He couldn't deny that her work was important, even vital. But it wasn't just about her legal expertise, it was about the humanity behind the cases she fought. For the first time, he felt that the law he had so diligently served might need to be questioned and shaped by something deeper than mere rules. "I never looked at it that way," Hughes admitted quietly, staring down at his coffee cup. "I spent so much time focused on the letter of the law that I failed to see the human side of it, the lives that it affects. I didn't realize how much people like you, people like those you represent, are doing to fill the gaps where the law falls short." Naomi studied him carefully. His words felt genuine, and the shift in his perspective was tangible. But she knew better than to expect change overnight. The judicial system was vast, and one conversation could not undo years of ingrained habits and assumptions. Still, there was a spark of hope in her that hadn't been there before. Judge Hughes was seeing things through a different lens, and that, she knew, could lead to something more substantial. "Judge, I don't expect you to change everything in a day," Naomi said, her tone gentle but resolute. "But maybe, just maybe, this conversation is a start, a small step toward understanding the bigger picture. And if we can start from there, perhaps we can start making a real difference." For a moment, there was silence between them. The judge was lost in thought, reflecting on the conversation and the implications it held for his own approach to justice. Naomi, on the other hand, was preparing to leave. She had more work ahead of her, but this meeting had given her something valuable. A reminder that change could come from unexpected places, even from those who initially seemed far removed from the fight she waged every day. Judge Hughes stood first, offering Naomi a sincere handshake. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said. "I'll be thinking about what you've said. I won't forget this conversation." Naomi smiled, a small but knowing smile. "Thank you, Judge. I'll hold you to that." As they parted ways, Naomi felt a shift within herself as well. She had not only gained a new ally, but she had also planted a seed of change in someone who held the power to influence far more than just the outcome of her parking ticket. In the weeks that followed, Naomi returned to her work with renewed vigor, though the conversation with Judge Hughes stayed with her. It wasn't just the potential allyship that had sparked a change in her. It was the reminder that even the smallest of moments could lead to significant transformations. She had always fought for justice, for the soldiers who needed a voice, but now she was fighting for something larger, an opportunity to influence the very systems that had previously ignored the voices of the people she served. Meanwhile, Judge Hughes was also undergoing a quiet transformation. He had begun reviewing past cases with a fresh perspective. His understanding of military law deepened, and he found himself questioning some of the decisions he had made over the years. Naomi's words continued to echo in his mind, urging him to think not just about the rules, but about the lives behind those rules. His sense of duty was no longer confined to the rigid application of legal statutes. It now carried a sense of responsibility to the people who would be affected by those decisions. One day, while reviewing a case involving a veteran who had been denied disability benefits, Hughes realized how much he had missed in the past. The case seemed straightforward at first, but as he dug deeper, he uncovered discrepancies in the veteran's military records. Discrepancies that had led to a wrongful denial of benefits. It wasn't the kind of case he would have paid much attention to before, but now it felt personal. He took the extra step to contact the veteran directly, ensuring they would have the proper representation. Across town, Naomi was preparing for one of her biggest cases yet, a legal battle with a private defense contractor that had failed to uphold its promises to veterans injured on the job. It was a complicated case, one that had dragged on for years. Naomi knew it was her chance to make a statement, not just for her clients, but for the future of military advocacy. The day the case went to trial, she noticed a familiar face in the courtroom. Judge Hughes had been assigned as the presiding judge. Her heart skipped a beat, and she immediately thought back to their conversation. She had no idea whether he had remembered their talk or if it had changed him in any way. But as the trial began, she could feel the difference. There was a level of empathy in his questions, a sense of understanding in his rulings that hadn't been there before. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Hughes gave the veterans the respect they deserved. He listened carefully, asking questions that probed deeper than the surface of the case. Naomi noticed that he seemed less concerned with the technicalities and more focused on the human impact. It was a subtle shift, but it didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the courtroom. When the final ruling was announced, Naomi couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. The defense contractor was ordered to pay reparations to the injured veterans, a decision that would set a powerful precedent for similar cases in the future. After the trial, Naomi approached Judge Hughes. There was a silent understanding between them, an acknowledgement of the change they had both undergone. "Thank you, Judge," Naomi said, her voice warm but steady, for seeing the bigger picture. Hughes met her gaze, his expression sincere. "Thank you, Miss Carter, for showing me what that picture really looks like." As they parted ways, Naomi felt a quiet sense of triumph. She had not only won a case that would affect the lives of many veterans, but she had also played a part in opening a judge's eyes to a new way of thinking about justice. Change, she realized, was never as fast or as easy as she wanted it to be. But it was happening. One case, one conversation, one moment at a time. Months passed since that pivotal trial, and Naomi could feel the ripple effects of the changes that had begun, not only within Judge Hughes but throughout the legal community. The case against the defense contractor had been a landmark decision, one that garnered media attention and made waves within both military and veteran circles. Naomi's clients were finally receiving the reparations they had long been denied, and for many, it felt like a hard-earned victory in their long battle for justice. Judge Hughes, for his part, had quietly but decisively altered his approach to the law. He had started taking a closer look at cases involving military personnel and veterans, looking beyond the surface and considering the broader human stories behind each file. He had become more involved in military justice reforms, attending conferences, and engaging with experts in the field. His reputation as a tough, no-nonsense judge was still intact, but there was now an added layer of empathy in his decisions, a balance of justice and compassion that had been lacking before. The most significant change, however, was in the way he viewed Naomi. She had come into his courtroom that day with nothing more than a simple legal matter, a parking violation, but she had left a lasting impression. Naomi had reminded him that justice wasn't just about applying the law. It was about recognizing the complexities of the human experience and understanding the responsibility that came with wielding the power of the law. One afternoon, as Naomi sat in her office working on yet another case, she received an unexpected call. It was Judge Hughes. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about the work you do, and I'd like to invite you to speak at an upcoming judicial conference. It's focused on military and veterans law, and I believe your perspective could be incredibly valuable for my colleagues." Naomi was taken aback. It was the kind of invitation she had never expected to receive from someone who had once seemed so distant, so entrenched in his own view of the law. She had no doubt that Judge Hughes' transformation had been a significant part of this shift, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I'd be honored, Judge," Naomi replied, her voice filled with warmth. "Thank you for the opportunity." As she hung up the phone, Naomi sat back in her chair, a feeling of fulfillment settling over her. She had come a long way from the parking violation in the courthouse. What had seemed like a simple, inconsequential moment had turned into a catalyst for something far more profound. Through her work, she had not only fought for her clients' rights, but had also inspired change in the very system that had once seemed so unyielding. Naomi's journey had always been about more than winning cases. It was about creating lasting impact. And now, as she prepared to speak at the conference, she realized that her influence had spread farther than she had ever imagined. What had begun as a single conversation had sparked a chain reaction, one that was reshaping the way justice was understood and applied. And for Naomi, that was the greatest victory of all. As she walked out of her office to prepare for the upcoming speech, Naomi glanced at the framed picture of her father on the wall. His words echoed in her mind. Fight for what's right, and you'll change the world, even if it's just one person at a time. She smiled softly, knowing that, in her own way, she was doing just that.